This is my claim that Africa will be the first continent to develop cargo drone delivery at a very large scale. When I say an industrial scale, obviously I'm following on from William's excellent talk and talking about the fourth industrial revolution. So we have to think, what will industry look like, and indeed, what would a super advanced cargo drone look like in the 2050s? And possibly it might be like this, which is from the film Wakanda. And then we have to ask ourselves, where is Wakanda? And obviously, where's the pointer? Oops, sorry. My Rwandan friends, particularly President Kagame, would like Wakanda to be over here, but Regional Commissioner, for the purposes of cargo drone revolution, we'd like Wakanda to be down here in Mwanza. I think it's genuinely, and I put my cynical old former economist reporter hat on here, I think it's incredibly likely that in the late 2030s, this is what Dar es Salaam might look like, that we will have high-density cargo drone routes which are running alongside ground infrastructure. And it is impossible to imagine, and the World Bank can verify this, that we're going to make up the infrastructure spending gap which Africa has, which is running between 50 and 80 billion dollars a year. So we need to be thinking about new solutions. There's simply not enough money in the system, and there's not enough other people in the planet who care enough about Africa to provide the money that's required to build that infrastructure. So whatever we do here in Africa, it has to be done in a new way. And I think this is entirely plausible. But I'm more interested today in thinking about this particular vision, which is a vision for smaller towns in Africa, for integrating cargo drone transport into all the other arrays of forms of logistics. And you can see in this picture here that this is an important point, that we are developing this technology in the digital age where African towns are not going to develop retail the way that Europe and the United States develop retail. So people will have access to smartphones with an enormous amount of choice on those smartphones. How they choose those goods and how they share goods is going to happen on different platforms. And so I do believe that we're going to see a situation in the next 10 years where new e-commerce providers will emerge up. Let's say you want to buy a pair of sunglasses in Mwanza. Now you probably have a choice of 2 shops in the mall, probably not the best sunglasses in the world. Maybe there'll be a Tanzania sunglass hut where you will order your sunglasses, and some of those goods might be delivered by drone. Another important point in this image is really always to emphasize that I'm very kali towards the Silicon Valley disruption model. I think this is not a helpful model in the African context. What we want to talk about here is supplemental technologies. We know, and all of our Tanzanian ministerial friends live with this every day, that we have 70% youth unemployment, underemployment. Where are the jobs going to come from? This is a real issue. So we need to think about this technology not as some remote warehouse on the edge of town, which a few lucky business investors develop profit from, but that it can be something that ordinary people can share, and that is where the Droneport concept becomes critical. Just going to run very quickly through a few mega trends. As was mentioned, I was Africa correspondent for The Economist for a decade, and I was one of those people who wrote this story about Africa, Africa rising. Now I would say, if I was going to write the same story again, we might say Africa wavering, or Africa we don't know, because at the moment there's been tremendous progress and it's possible to create a very positive story of how economies are going. But fundamentally, there are not enough jobs. There's an extraordinary stress on the agriculture and ecological systems in Africa. And I think, unfortunately, social media, technology, and other new trends will be fairly disruptive politically. This, I think, is interesting just to run through. I'm not going to go through all of those elements, but you can see here, this is what's happened to foreign direct investment, energy use, fertilizer use. We're living in an extremely turbocharged anthropocentric moment. This obviously has extraordinary consequences on our natural living systems. We see that CO2 is going up. This is what's happening to the surface temperature of our planet. And we can see that aquaculture will increase. And obviously, this is directly relevant here in Wanza, where we really worry about the state of Lake Victoria as a living space. I do believe that there will be a lot of money available in the next 10, 20 years. We've seen the beginning of it for decarbonizing infrastructure and really thinking about how to build in a lighter way. And if we're speaking cynically from government of Tanzania, World Bank point of view, and any of our East African and other African governments here, I think that there will be money lines in the hundreds of millions for developing cargo drone networks, simply because they are low to zero carbon. And that's an important asset that they have. Very quickly, China. This is the relationship of China to Africa. It's friendly, but somewhat intimidating. And this, of course, is directly relevant to where we are now. And almost all cargo drone technology, one way or another, will come out of this southern region of China. Most of the drone companies are there. That's where most of the big artificial intelligence players are. And of course, I would imagine that there's very few people in the room who are holding a mobile phone in their pocket, which is not Chinese manufactured. So China's big goal in the next 20 years is to reorientate the axis of the planet from a north-south commercial direction to an east-west commercial direction. That makes Lake Victoria and Central East Africa really very interesting to Chinese investors. That is something which is directly relevant to the development of this particular technology. Very quickly, I'm not going to bore everyone by reiterating what we all know, that there are a lot of mobile phones. But I will just say that when I was, the reason I'm standing here today is because of this particular phone. I would have been just a normal foreign correspondent, but I came to understand that this phone, the Nokia 1100, sold 53 million handsets in Africa and was known as the Kalashnikov of communication. What was really my interesting to me observation was that mobile phone networks were incredibly robust. Even in Somalia, where I was reporting as a war correspondent, even in Shabab areas, jihadist areas, where there was a famine, you could find 2 or 3 mobile phone networks working when the people were starving to death and when people were cutting each other's heads off. And what was the takeaway for that was that if a network pays incremental value, then the network is fairly robust. And I think, again, that's something to bear in mind with a cargo drone logistics network, is that it may look a fragile network, but obviously security is the most important element. We have to get the safety right. This is the obvious starting point. Assuming we get that right, Then you have a network which is these fleets of drones are taking off at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they're going to load up Uka Railway Island before most people have even woken up, and vice versa. So, and there will be that incremental flow of value. This was mentioned, at the moment I'm visiting professor in artificial intelligence, so most of my day is spent thinking about artificial intelligence. This is actually from computing and what is happening right now with computing. I won't get too technical, but essentially what you had here was supercomputers, platforms, and nodes on the network accessing that huge amount of information, which is now, by the way, relatively small, the supercomputers of yesteryear to today. This is where we are right now, where we have quite large monopolistic Silicon Valley technology companies and nodes based off them. This is where we are heading to through distributed computing or blockchain technologies. What I love about this is that this is replicated in biology, and it's also replicated in the logistics industry. If you were going to get a very wise logistics person on the stage, they would say, yeah, that's where we're going. And this, again, is where cargo drones are really interesting, is if we think about this as Mwanza region, RC, you could imagine that this is where you are now. You've got a few hubs. But where the opportunity in this technology is not that everything has to come back through Mwanza. No, you can actually have communities communicating stuff to each other, small packages that they need and are willing to pay for. That, I think, is transformative. And I think it's also transformative in the African context in general, that most middle-sized towns in Africa are not very well connected to each other. Very quickly on the, JP, how are we doing on time? Oh, cool. Going too fast. Okay, so I mentioned that with Lord Norman Foster. Those of you who are not into architecture may not know Norman. He's a British so-called starchitect who has built the largest airports in the world. So he built Beijing Airport, he built Heathrow Terminal 5. He developed the modern typology for an airport. So whenever you go into an airport which has lots of windows, that's him. And I went to Norman, I knew him, and I said, look, Norman, you've built the largest airports in the world. Maybe you can come to Africa and build the smallest. And he very much liked this idea. So we spent a couple of years thinking through what should be a drone port in the African context, and really thinking through some of the elements, and from the starting point of a new typology. So a petrol station at one point did not exist, then it existed. We still have that typology of a petrol station. You know, the pumps are there, your car comes in, there's some kind of shelter or hood. Ditto railway stations in the Victorian age. It's very rare in architecture or engineering that you get a chance to create an entirely new typology. And it's unheard of that Africa can be the place where that typology is dictated to the rest of the planet. And that's what I feel is truly exciting about what we're undertaking here. Just very briefly, if you look at the image, this bit is the community area of the Droneport. You really want the community to be active and to be bringing stuff back and forth into a Droneport. The middle bit is what William referred to in terms of digital fabrication. So you can imagine in the middle of a Droneport, you would have a fab lab. And what we'd like to see next year when we build the first Droneport in or around Mwanza is that Droneport comes fully equipped with all the things that the drone fleet needs. And at the end is the drone operations. One thing I find kind of interesting about this image is that we were too conservative in our vision, because when we started thinking through what a Droneport should be, we were told that we were going to have fixed-wing only planes which had to land on a small runway. It was not realistic to imagine a drone capable of carrying significant cargo, which could take off vertically and shoot off. But we were wrong, and Wingcopter and other teams have shown us we're wrong. So you can imagine that this Droneport will become much more compact in that sense. Yeah, so this is just another reference point on how the Droneport should look within the community. Obviously, zero carbon, so we're really heading into a solar age. It's absurd to imagine that electric drones are not charged from solar or renewable energy. That's pretty obvious. And then, you know, just from a government perspective, my argument for Droneports is that there should be a middle mile solution. I'm not at all a believer in last mile delivery by drones in the African context. I very much want this guy to make a few bob every day on his boda. That's critical, you know. And I also do believe from a security point of view, from a civil aviation point of view, from a national intelligence point of view, it's not cool to imagine a craft which you don't know what they are and where they're going. It may well be in the mid-term, 20 years' time, we might have got over all of our inhibitions and we might be secure enough. But at the beginning, I think we do need these Droneports. And obviously, what you'd like to see is a really professional behavior that you would see in an airport, the way that cargo is handled and stored, and it's safe and professional, and it's providing jobs. I think that's critical. These are just drawings that Norman Foster himself did, and really emphasizing that Droneports can be built of local materials. Again, and this is not to get on China's case, because obviously I'm British and we have our own sins to bear, but I find it ridiculous that we're importing steel and glass in such large quantities from China. I think that it's possible when we build this typology of Droneport to think it through in a way which is much more locally sensitive, cheaper and affordable. And that little drawing down there, some of you who are into architecture, the biggest event in architecture in the world is called the Venice Biennale, which is in Venice in Italy. And we built a little example of a mini African Droneport there, which was very successful. Though I say it myself. Yeah, here's zipline. I developed the concept at EPFL in Switzerland of blood delivery with our guys, and then we took that to zipline and introduced zipline into Rwanda, to the blood banks in Rwanda, and I have to give a big shout out to them. I do think that in the medical emergency space, that last mile delivery is still quite relevant, and it's worth pointing out that 40% of the blood in Rwanda today is flown day to day by drone. So that's already happening. It's positive. This is an image, might be relevant to Mr. Dunford from the World Food Programme. This is some of my students in Switzerland in the architecture school developed this model, which I can share for anyone who's interested, of a very uber low-cost Droneport for a refugee camp, a displaced persons camp. In this case, it was Dadaab camp, close to the Somali border in Kenya. So 350,000 people in that camp. And what is interesting there, and what is interesting in general across East Africa, is I talked about the temporal nature of cargo drones, i.e. that they're likely to do most of their flying at night when most people are asleep. That's really cool. The other element of cargo drones is, just as in Northern Europe, we get out our snowplows in the wintertime and we put them away in the summer. In the African context, I'm on top of it, JP. In the African context, we can imagine that in the rainy season, there would be much more dense traffic of cargo drones than in the dry season. Because maybe the motorbike is or the pickup truck is viable in the dry season, can hammer along at a high speed, but maybe in the rainy season, not so much. So that's just one other point to bear in mind. I just wanted to finish in the last minute by thinking through where we think we might go next in terms of development bank money, industry money, and so on. So what we'd like to see next year, phase 1, is let's hook up, I don't know where Juma is, it's somewhere around here, isn't it? Juma Island. It's a little bit further up, yeah. But anyway, we'd like to see a route out here and a route up here next year. We'd like to have a go at building a real drone port with a real fab lab and getting really brainy people from across Tanzania and across East Africa based here as a kind of day-to-day hub. We'd like to get that traffic going. I personally think it's a really good idea to think about government services. It can be paperwork, it can be spare parts. I know from my personal research in the Lake region that cash is something that can be flown tomorrow, because a lot of the mobile money cash out bureaus, they don't have enough cash. And then when people want to go and pay off the fishermen, they have to travel with quite large amounts of cash over the lake to the islands and pay off the fishermen. So I actually think it's quite realistic to imagine putting wads of cash in the sky and flying around, which initially would seem like a terrifying idea, but don't forget we have ATM machines everywhere and they're seldom hacked into. So that would be like phase 1. Let's think about that. Then, we go over towards Gaita and then towards Rwanda and think about extending that network outwards along the lake. At the same time, I know from talking to President Kagame in Rwanda that Rwanda is very keen on building its drone port system around the corners of the country. And we can imagine here there will be a route across the border to Bukoba, and then we'll see a route down there. And phase 3, I would think, which might be around 2023, 2025. We don't know what's going to happen with the Isaka-Kigali railway, but at the moment, we seem to be optimistic that that railway, which is, does anyone remember how many billions it is? $3 billion, $4 billion project? Edward? No? So anyway, it's a large project, and I can really imagine that the drone ports can be seeded along railway infrastructure at a very low cost. So if the railway costs, let's say, $3 billion, it's definitely 50 to 80 million to equip it with 21st century drone ports, which can fly off back and forward. And then the final point, just to really emphasize this point, is what we're talking about is adding 3, 5, 8% to the economy. I don't mean in GDP terms, I mean just in logistical speed. So you're not going to put your mangoes in the sky. You may put tilapia fillets in the sky, possibly. You may even have different types of cargo drones which carry food aid, possibly. But in general, we're talking about small, high-value loads that people are prepared to pay for to get in a timely fashion. But the really critical point is that it speeds up the intelligence of the local economy. People get to choose what they want, when they want it, how they want it, and all kinds of new business models are possible because of that. Anyway, thank you.